Is the squatting a big problem for California? A lot of people say this is overly exaggerated by the media and is not as bad. Our guest today is Jonathan Madison, who's a real estate attorney who has dealt firsthand with squatting cases and he's seen a trend. He's here to tell us what's going on with squatting in California, and if as an homeowner, if there are any ways or any laws that can help you protect yourself.
I mean, it was just very evident for everybody in the court to see this guy is playing the system. He took a buyout. It's a shame because we're not only emboldening con artists, but we're basically legalizing theft.
I'm Siama Korami. Welcome to California Insider. Jonathan, it's great to have you back. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me back. It's good to see you.
We want to talk to you about squatting because squatting in California and the rest of the country, it's happening. How big is it?
You know, it's massive right now, and it's beyond the state of California. It's nationwide. They're having a squatting issue. That's why you're hearing like people like DeSantis and different big names in different states that are actually taking action to address the squatting issues in those states. California, unfortunately, we're behind on the laws that actually address squatting. We've made some attempts, but it's far and wide. It's beyond the inner cities. It's beyond the urban areas. It's everywhere.
We really want to understand how the laws work. We have had guests on the show, and you told us about it too in the past, but if somebody breaks into your property, and how does it work? Like they can come in and take over? Can you explain?
You know, I wish it weren't that simple, but in California right now, it just about is. CMAC, in theory, one can come to your property, say you have an investment property, or say your property, you haven't checked on it for a month or so. You're not really going to know if a squatter has come or someone's broken into your property, unless perhaps you've installed some kind of a Ring camera device. But it is easy enough for a person in California today, and they're protected by California law, by the way, to come into someone's home that's not theirs, somehow gain access to it, rekey it, break in somehow, stay there for a period of time, could be a matter of days or weeks, and when the owner comes back to that property, the squatter can tell the police when they come, I live here, I have rights. The part that's very difficult for a lot of people to digest is the fact that the squatter doesn't have to prove that they have a lease, that they have an identification consistent with their identity there in the home. They don't have to show proof of people who know them to live at that place. All they have to do under California law today, and these are the protections, whether you still call them protections after this interview, these are the protections that say, if you somehow find yourself in a different home or find a way into someone else's home and you're able to articulate to the police officer, I'm here, I have rights, this is my place, the police officer 9 times out of 10 will look at you and say, well, I can't do anything, and they'll look at the landlord and they'll say, it's a civil issue. And the squatter will be able to live there until that landlord, property owner, pays to get them out by legal action, and that's pretty much how it goes.
Have you seen that happen?
I have, more often than I would like, I'll tell you that. And even one time was too often. But Stephanie Warren, who was another, a former participant, a guest of yours, she was the first client that I had that really encountered this issue. And this was about 2 years ago when it happened to her. She had just recently purchased a property in Oakland, and this was sort of an investment property. She had only had it on about 3 weeks or a month or so, and she was planning to make renovations to it, go in, and so when she went inside the property after escrow closed, she noticed that it had been broken into. There was some glass on the floor and some things happened. And so she goes in, finds that there are squatters there, somebody with a baseball bat saying, get out of my house, get out of my property. The irony, they said my property. And so what does she do? The same thing any other landlord or property owner would do, she calls the police. So the police show up. Fortunately, she has Ring camera footage of them breaking into her property. She thinks that'll be fine. She calls me up on the other line and says, stand by, you're my attorney. You need to say anything. And I'm just as much in shock and awe as she is when I hear the police officer say, there's nothing we can do, it's a civil matter. You have to get a court order from a judge to get these people out. And she asked me if that was the truth. I said, well, I think the police should remove them, but I don't know what to do in this situation because California law appears to protect them. And so that was the first time I'd encountered a client issue that actually dealt with this issue.
If you have this situation, God forbid you have it, what's the process of going through that?
And when you say the process, just kind of how to get a squatter out, kind of step by step. So there's a couple of things any property owner or landlord should know in California right now. SB 602, that's Senate bill, and Senate Bill 448. Those are laws that have made it somewhat easier to get a squatter out. They basically say, okay, if you post a 72-hour notice on your door, right, you can ask the authorities, serve a copy on the local sheriff, but you can ask the authorities to remove the squatter. Unfortunately, I haven't seen it work yet. So with this caveat out there, it may not work. But you should take action, in advance of any potential squatter coming, right? If you have an investment property, a vacation home out there, you're going to be gone from your property for several weeks. Post the appropriate notice, and hopefully you can do something about it.
So essentially, you can go get a permit for a while. Is it a year? There's some.
Yes, it's been extended up to a year by way of SB 602, and so you can do that, and you can continue to renew it.
So you can before, if you have a second home or if you have a vacation home or if you're going on a long vacation, you should go and apply for that. Is that how?
Well, actually, it's something you don't actually need to apply for, fortunately. This is something, it's basically a notice that you can post on your door, post on the property. The only catch is you have to serve the notice, and it has to have the right language. So not telling anyone to go out there on ChatGPT and rely on it, right? Make sure you get the help of a professional to do it so it's effective. But you would take that notice that's correctly drawn up, you would take it to the sheriff, you would let the sheriff's office know, I'm going to be out of town, or I'm worried about a potential outsider coming into my home. Please be on standby and alert. And they lodge it in their files, and they're supposed to await a phone call from you if and when something happens.
So essentially, you have to go to the sheriff's office to file for that
Yes.
if you have a doubt that somebody may break in.
Yes. And it's kind of like Minority Report, right? I mean, you don't really know until you know that a squatter is going to break into your property. But unfortunately, it's a measure that I would encourage just about any California landowner or property owner to take,
Just to be safe beforehand, right?
just to be on the safe side. Otherwise, you'll be paying an attorney a lot of money to get that squatter out, which goes to your question about the process, CMAC. If you don't have that measure in place, and perhaps if you do have it and the authorities still don't act, which is a possibility, the law doesn't actually say the sheriff or the police officers have to act. It just says they may enforce, right? So that's a caveat. But the process is, if you find yourself in a situation where you have a squatter there, you don't know, some kind of stranger, whoever it is in your property, first thing you do, I still say contact the local authorities. Perhaps there's a chance that some officer or sheriff out there might do the right thing. They might feel they can do it in their jurisdiction. I don't know anyone who doesn't in San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose, San Mateo. I mean, I could go down the list of places, but that's the first step. Call the local law enforcement. Make sure you have a police report on file. Then you would want to retain counsel, retain an attorney to file an action for eviction. They'll post the appropriate notice on the door saying they have to leave within a specified time. If they don't leave within that specified time, you file the unlawful detainer action. That's an eviction action for those who may not know. And you get a court date. You hope that the tenant or the squatter here, you hope that they don't hire an attorney that's paid for by your tax dollar as a landowner, right, as a property owner. You hope that they don't hire free legal assistance, because they can file all kinds of motions to delay the process.
Even though they're squatters, is that?
Even though they're squatters. In fact, CMAC, I think the irony in my profession right now is most of the squatter cases I deal with, they're able to retain free legal counsel that's paid for by all of our tax dollars.
That's essentially put aside for tenants, right?
Yes.
Because when sometimes some landlords may be doing wrong things for the tenants, and this is to protect the tenants, right?
Exactly, exactly. Well, you hit it on the nail there. It's protecting tenants, but it's not necessarily protecting squatters. The problem with California law right now is that the law doesn't distinguish between a squatter and a tenant on its face. And squatters have gotten roped into this classification of being deemed a tenant. And that's dangerous because it puts the law in a situation where it's emboldening con artists and people who are breaking into homes. It's saying you can do this and still be protected if you do it the right way and you know the lingo. Tell the police officers tenant rights, civil rights, and then all of a sudden you have free access to utilize someone else's property. And it's really a shame. It's really, and this was born out of the COVID-19 crisis, of course, the pandemic. But it's a shame because we've really found ourselves now in a place where we're not only emboldening con artists, but we're basically legalizing theft.
If you like to know what's happening in California, you definitely should read the Epoch Times newspaper. There's a section in there that talks about California and California news in a very nonpartisan, non-biased, factual, calm manner. For example, one of the stories here is about gas prices. Lawmakers are asking the regulators what's going on with the gas prices in California. This story has all the details of what happened. We also have other stories in there. One of the most fascinating ones is how the wolves are attacking farmers and ranchers, their cattle. Now, the state has been responding to these attacks by launching a map to help farmers and ranchers know where the wolves are. This is an amazing and fascinating story. We've been following it at Epoch Times. There's a lot more stories in here that you should be checking out. If you find these stories interesting, make sure to check out the Epoch Times newspaper. We'll leave you a link below. We have a special offer for our followers, for our fans. It's $1 a week. Make sure to check it out, and if you like it, subscribe. Now let's go back to the interview. So you were mentioning the process. If they could delay the process, but what's usually the length of the process and how much does it cost?
I will say it varies depending on what county you're in. On average, I'd say the process could be anywhere from 4 to 8 months, depending on the jurisdiction you're in and depending on how much motion practice, how much fight you get from the other side. And then in some cases, the squatter, in fact, in a number of cases, the squatter will get paid to leave by the landlord on top of all the other legal fees. So you'll end up in a situation where if you're the landowner, CMAC, you've not only lost 8 months potentially of rent at your property, you've let someone stay in your property, you've paid for the utility bills, you've paid for water, you've paid for garbage, you've paid for heating, because California law requires you to do all that, by the way. You'll get sued by the squatter if you don't. But you've done all that, you've lost rent, and then on top of that, the squatter often gets paid like a buyout sum that can range anywhere from 10 to 20, I've seen up to $100,000 to leave someone's place, right? And that's the kind of thing we're dealing with right now.
Have you dealt with cases like that where your customers had to pay?
I have. I have a client up in Red Bluff. Perhaps you want to interview him. I won't disclose his name here, but I have a client up in Red Bluff. He has 3 properties up there, and he paid a contractor to kind of do some rehabilitation work, some renovations on 2 of the other properties. The contractor lives in one property. And the contractor one day decided, wow, well, why don't I just, allow myself access to the other 2 units and move my family, my girlfriend, and all these other people into those other units. And so that's what he did. So my client now is in a position where he has to make a decision to go through this heavy litigation process or pay a pretty good sum to the contractor. And I think he's going to pay a sum to the contractor because he understands he gets his property back sooner that way. But otherwise, he's going to also be paying me to litigate this process. And so at some point when you're a landowner, you also got to determine, how am I going to put food on the table still? How am I going to pay for the mortgage, right? He's thinking, well, I may do better if I pay this guy to leave next month so I can put some people back into those properties, cover the mortgage. I can't tell you the number of people, landowners, who have gone bankrupt because of this phenomenon.
And you are in the thick of all this, right? You're seeing a lot of cases, right?
Squarely in the thick of it. Squarely in the thick of it. I was, and it's common in practice, CMAC, for attorneys in the profession to talk, right? I was talking with another property owner attorney. He was telling me about a case that he had down in Los Angeles. It really almost brought me to tears. He talked about how his client was a single mother, worked 2 jobs, a lot of her life. Her father passed away, and she inherited a condo, right? Nice condo down there. And as she was in her grieving stage, I mean, you can't do a whole lot when you're in that grieving phase, right? As she was grieving, she went, I guess she checked both the units or one of the units, found out that a squatter had moved in and started just kind of living there, living in the property. And she obviously just didn't know what to do. So she contacted an attorney, eventually got back to the person that I talked to. And even with him, I consider him a great attorney, great at what he does. It took him almost a year to get that tenant out of that unit. And this is a single mother we're talking about. She didn't have a whole lot of money. The single mothers are some of the people, the individuals we should be fighting hardest to protect in this society. They're the most vulnerable. I read about a veteran up in Oakland, like 15 minutes from where I am, CMAC, San Francisco. I read about a veteran who had returned from a long hospital stay. He was battling a pretty big health condition. So he returns home, finds squatters that had found their way inside of his house. He called the police, thought that he would have some clout by telling the police officers, I'm a veteran of the country. And the police officers told him what I told you earlier, it's a civil matter. So we have this veteran that ended up sleeping in his vehicle for months while the squatters occupied his house until he could afford some legal representation. It's these kinds of stories, CMAC, that for me just tells me how far from just of a society that we are. We talk about tenants' rights being civil rights, so are property rights. Yeah, everybody talks about tenants' rights. What about property owner rights? Those are civil rights as well. And when you have laws that are supposed to or intended to protect, purported to protect the most vulnerable in our society, tenants, people at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, have someone tell me who's protecting the homeless veteran, who's protecting the single mother, those people who happen to own property and that aren't rich and wealthy.
You mentioned that you cannot turn the power, electricity, and all those things off. You get sued. How does that work?
There is a law in California that basically says if someone is occupying your property, you cannot turn off the electricity, you can't turn off the power and electric, you can't turn off the heat, can't turn off the garbage, any of that. And the idea behind that is what we call
To protect the tenant, probably, right?
Exactly. And look, CMAC, if you had a law-abiding tenant, if you had a tenant, right, you have a lease agreement with the tenant, of course they deserve working heat, they deserve access to water, running water, hot water, they deserve access to a habitable living condition. And in the law, we call that the habitability, warranty of habitability, the implied warranty of habitability, if you want to get technical about it. But it's this idea that every tenant or occupant of property has rights to live in comfortable conditions, habitable conditions. The problem here is that you and I should clearly, and hopefully most of the viewers should clearly be able to distinguish one who breaks into someone's home and unlawfully stays there from one who has a legal lease agreement, enforceable lease agreement, to actually live there. I pay rent there, I stay there. Even if I don't pay rent there, the landlord knows who I am and I'm lawfully living here, right? the law does not distinguish that right now. The law says if you have an occupant in your home, period, they are entitled to running water, heat, gas, and electric.
It doesn't matter how they got in.
Doesn't matter how they got it. Law says they're entitled to all the utilities. They're on Netflix and Hulu while you're at it. You know, that's a joke. They're not entitled to Netflix or Hulu. But and it's a little sarcasm. But the point is, how is a law, how is a justice system going to penalize landlords for not having their lights on or their gas and electric, all these things, for someone who's broken into their home? And that's the problem that you probably read about this story down in Los Angeles. An elderly lady, a senior, who had actually rented out an Airbnb to a tenant. And I'm sorry, she actually didn't rent it out. She had an Airbnb, a squatter broke into the Airbnb, stayed, and then the squatter ended up suing her because she had turned off the lights, the gas and electric. She was dealing with some hard times. She didn't even know the guy was there. And so he sued her.
Wow.
And so I think they ended up settling after about 8 to 11 months or so. But when you end up in a situation, if you're a property owner, you either work your butt off to get the property, you inherited the property, you know, somehow you got access to that property. You want to shut off your lights, you want to turn off the utilities, it's lawful, but because someone broke into your home and took possession, now you're required to make sure they have running water. You're basically furnishing their lifestyle. You're making sure that they have a place that's habitable. You're making sure they have comfort. Someone who stole your property, stole your possession. And I just think that's fundamentally wrong.
Now, Jonathan, some people say that this whole squatting issue is overblown in the media. You know, there's too much talk about it. You are seeing this on the ground. Do you see more? There's not a lot of data about it, right?
You know, there's not, I'll say this, there's not as much data on
The numbers.
on the mainstream as there should be. You know, I'll tell you this, as someone who's boots on the ground, who's in the court system just about every day, who works with real clients, people in real time who have dealt with the issue, I don't think it's overblown at all. I don't think it's amplified enough. And I'll tell you why. I think if it were amplified enough, we'd have some law in place enacted that said, okay, well, we're going to listen to common sense and let's just make it very simple, CMAC, very simple. If you can prove that you live there, you could show a lease agreement, you could show some identification, maybe even know someone who could say, yeah, I think he lives there. Okay, well, then you're good. You're fine. If you can't do that, and perhaps it's documented on some kind of a Ring camera device that you broke in and it's that obvious, you don't get to stay. You should be removed by a police or the sheriff. I think if we had a law enacted that were that simple, common sense, straightforward, I don't think you'd hear about these situations, you know.
And have you seen more? When was you said the first time you saw a couple of years ago. What happened after the pandemic? Was there another law that caused this, or?
I would qualify that, right? Because the pandemic, you had all these laws that were born out of the pandemic, right? You had the Tenant Protection Act is one of them, but you had the eviction moratoriums, of course, and you had these laws within the eviction moratoriums that said, you know, if you're living in a property, you know, doesn't matter if you don't have a lease agreement, doesn't matter if your lease agreement is slated to end at a certain time, you're protected. You know, and look, it was an emergency situation. There was a lot going on. We understand that was a tumultuous time for our nation, the world. But after the so-called eviction moratoriums expired, we still have those laws in place, right? That say, hey, if you're an occupant, it doesn't necessarily matter how you got there. You have rights, right? That's kind of how we got here. And I think the solution is just kind of retweaking it to make common sense again.
California Insider is partnering with Californians with Energy and Science to have a panel on energy issues in California. from the regulatory side of things to innovation. This panel is going to be on June 13th in our studio. Make sure to sign up. We'll look forward to seeing you here in person. So, Jonathan, in your experience, you have been seeing some of these individuals that are doing the squatting, right? You've had to deal with them in court. What are they like?
They range in personalities. There are some commonalities that I've seen. Again, not generalizing all squatters out there, but from what I've seen in court, there's a couple of different personalities I've seen. I've seen someone who was squatting in property who was asked questions by a judge. The judge was trying to ascertain whether they actually lived at the property or not. And the individual who was squatting in that particular property looks up at the judge and says, very confidently and very knowledgeable about the law, starts quoting the civil code, the evidence code, and says, oh, well, my rights are protected pursuant to. And I said, wow, this person sounds more articulate than their lawyer. So I remember, some of the lawyers that profession, we were just kind of talking. I said, how did that happen? But it tells me that the tenants really are, or some of these squatters really are that savvy. We're not just dealing with individuals who may be hard on luck or need a place to stay, but there are professionals out there, know their rights under California law, know how to quote them to a judge, know how to utilize the protections they have to stay in properties, and quote unquote game the system, right? You have those, and there's an example out there, the popular Malibu squatter, right? And short story is there's this individual who was going in different places in Malibu, squatting in different properties. Malibu, of all places, hence how they got the name. But it points out a bigger problem,
And it was getting paid, right, that individual?
Was getting paid to leave out of every one of these properties. It's a real operation. You break into the property, or you find a way to get into the property even if you don't break in. Some tenants were savvy enough to hire a locksmith to change the locks, prove to the locksmith, I don't know how you do that. Maybe you drop some fake lease or sham lease or something. Prove to the locksmith they had rights to the property. Locksmith changes the locks to let the people in. So you have people that do this, they'll stay on the property, and they'll get a check to leave. So it's a real operation. And while I have yet to find, and I'm not going to be a conspiracy theorist out there, but I have yet to find any legitimate organization out there of squatters, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are some kind of, whether groups or underground organizations, people that get together, whatever you want to call them, and literally plan out what properties they're going to squat in, how much they're going to get paid, and have a real strategy. Because the individual I just told you about was very savvy, very intelligent. So we're not just dealing with people that are hard on luck.
Tell us about this court case. Can you tell us what happened?
I represented the landowner who had a squatter living there in his property. Squatter had been there for a few weeks or so. Landlord filed the unlawful detainer action. So we're in court on the squatters. We're in court on my motion. We made a motion in conjunction with removing the squatter, right? We're basically trying to show and establish to the court the squatter does not have rights to be there, right? It's called a motion for summary judgment. And so the judge turns to the squatter to hear testimony directly from the squatter and says, can you tell us, can you give us some kind of proof that you actually have lived there? Can you show us some kind of what we call clear and convincing evidence that you live at the property? So the squatter proceeds to look into his backpack right there on the stand. He says, okay, well, he's looking for stuff. He pulls out some pieces of mail. He puts them on the table, gives them to the clerk. Clerk runs them up to the judge. As the judge is reviewing the documents, I guess these are purported documents that would show the squatter lives at the property, the judge looks at the squatter and he says, Well, as I'm reviewing these, can you tell me, what evidence other than this do you have that you live there? Do you have a lease? How do you know the property owner? Do you know the property owner? And the squatter says, well, the law says I don't need to know the property owner. And the judge looks at him and says, what? And the squatter says, yeah, well, under evidence code section, under penal, basically starts quoting all of these different laws, right? And I mean, it's actually pretty impressive from my standpoint to see someone in layman's terms, not an attorney, having understood and being able to articulate this in such a fashion. And so, I'm sitting there and I can't object. I mean, he's over there, he's the judge listening to him. And so I'm just appalled. I'm listening to this guy really tell the judge about what the law is, as if the judge didn't know himself. But the judge says, whoa, I know what the law says. What I'm trying to understand is, do you have any proof that you live there? And the tenant said, well, or the squatter rather, says, well, I gave you some pieces of mail. The mail just said it was like some medical bills from a different place. And then I think the squatter had some friend or two send him mail after the fact, just to show that he had residency. Some games that they play again.
Some letters from friends.
Yeah, some letters from friends, some postcards or something. And, so the judge ended up taking the matter under submission, but there was definitely an exchange there. The judge was, first of all, very surprised, but also very frustrated. And look, the courts in Alameda County are, I'd still say they lean, tenant friendly more often than not, just because of the demographic, the jurisdiction up there. But there was clearly an exchange, and everybody in the courtroom could see it. The judge was flustered, the squatter was confident, and I was confused. And so, but I think that illustration, a real illustration, tells us we have a problem that needs to be fixed. And I was encouraged that at least the judge took issue with it, right? The judge is not just saying, oh, well, let's give it a pass. The judges are actively scrutinizing these people and the situations. And, personally, I think maybe the squatter would have done better if he just said, hey, I'm on hard times. But you go the extra mile and say, oh, no, I know my rights. He basically, to me, he was saying, this is my business. This is what I do. And so you're not going to talk me out of this when I know what my rights are. And the fact that he said, yeah, I know what my rights are, and he started quoting his rights, he's quoting the law which protects him, and he does have rights. So, for me, puts me in an adverse position because I'm supposed to argue the law, but it's the contrary part of the law. But if he's quoting the law that protects him, I can't say it's not true. So anyways, that was the dynamic, though.
Did the judge make a decision to change that, or it had to go?
We ultimately did not win our motion for summary judgment because, again, of a loophole in the law. And so we ended up getting him out. We went to trial ultimately, and he took a buyout, and he ultimately left. But, as far as that motion, I mean, it was just very evident for everybody in the court to see this guy is playing the system, he's winning, and there's nothing even anyone can do about it because the judge is not going to change the law. All they can do is enforce it.
There is another concept. It's called adverse possession of homes.
Adverse possession, yeah.
Have you seen cases with this? And can you explain that for those people that have property, they should know about this?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, CMAC. Adverse possession, this is the concept they teach you in law school, and you have all these hypotheticals. And it's funny, I remember having hypotheticals, and now I'm seeing more of them in real time.
Did
Because
you
all
think
these
they
laws,
would be possible?
yeah, now they're possible, it's wow. So thank you to the California legislature. But in a nutshell, adverse possession requires, about 5 elements. I won't bore the people who are viewing out of their minds, but in a nutshell, adverse possession is, look, you have to have continuous and open possession of a property for about a 5-year period. It has to be open and notorious. That's what the law says. You have to pay taxes. You actually at least have to take actions on the property, right? You can't just be in hiding. People can't not know that you're around. You can't just, you can't be an adverse possession if you're hitting the whole time. It has to be very clear that, look, this is my place. I've taken steps to occupy it. And then after a certain period of time, I believe the law is still 5 years, the law can deem that you to actually have a stake or an interest in that property. The difference between adverse possession and what I'll call squatter possession is that squatters have come in different properties, and they're basically saying, well, yeah, this is my place. I'll kick my feet up, and I'm not going to pay the taxes. I'm not going to pay the rents. I'm not going to contribute, and I'm just going to stay here as long as I can. And by the way, the law says I may even be able to get a buyout. I may even be able to get a paycheck at the end of this. So, but that's the difference.
And there's no criminal consequences, or is it possible to go after people like that criminally?
It is, and to be fair, it is possible. The likelihood of success on the prosecution, I don't know. I'll tell you this: in my practice, since the day that I had the first encounter I told you about, I haven't seen one squatter prosecuted for squatting in the property, that at all. And I honestly don't know that the district attorney's offices in our state are taking those as a priority. And look, there are worse crimes out there. There are certainly more heinous crimes than staying at someone else's property, but doesn't mean the people breaking in shouldn't be penalized for it, And so that's why I take issue with it. Crime is going to happen, right? Whether it's people breaking into homes, breaking into cars, stealing things. In California, as you know, CMAC, you have that $999,
$950, which is gone now.
Which is gone now, right. But that was a thing for a while, and it was like, okay, finally someone woke up. But the point is, we know crime is going to happen, but without safeguards, without punishments of some kind, there's just no enforcement, and people are going to continue to do it because it's convenient.
Do you have any recommendation for our audience that might be concerned about this?
Well, there's two things. If you're a property owner out there or a landlord out there, I would tell you a few things. Number one, make sure you have a notice, the appropriate notice posted on your door.
So when you're not there, you should post a notice?
Absolutely. If you're not there, it's a 72-hour notice. Make sure you have the assistance of a professional to prepare the notice for you.
And you put it on your door? Is that how it works?
You put it on your door, actually all points of entry. So if you have a back door, you put it on the back door as well, side door, and make sure you serve that notice on your local sheriff's department. Make sure they understand you're going to be gone for a period of time so that they have had it documented as well. And so that's at least one thing you can actively do to stop someone from coming in. At least if they get in, you have a better chance of calling law enforcement and dealing with it. And, I think that's probably the largest viewership, probably viewing this video. If you're a law-abiding tenant, keep doing what you're doing. If you're a squatter, I hope the law changes. That's what I'll say.
And what about the law? What is needed to fix this?
For me, and it's funny, I was just having this conversation with my law partner. If it were up to me, I would make it a very blanket approach, and it would basically be an amendment to the Tenant Protection Act. I would have an amendment that said, to the extent one is deemed a squatter, we all know what a squatter is. We don't have to get into
Somebody
the language.
Broke in and took over here.
Right. To the extent one is deemed a squatter, cannot identify themselves upon request, cannot produce a lease agreement, and it is open and obvious that they are a squatter, they have no rights to possess the property of another. And they can be arrested at the discretion of the local law enforcement. And I think that language would be still very discretionary, very soft, because there are people out there that say, "What, you broke into a home, you should absolutely be prosecuted." At least you leave some discretion, for local law enforcement to exercise the punishment that they deem worthy, that meets the crime. San Francisco is different from Los Angeles, is different from Red Bluff and whatnot. So that's pretty much the change that I would see. It's very straightforward. You have people in the legislature that are saying, "Oh, if we amend 8 sections and codify this and get 300 letters from the departments," you don't need all of that. All you need is to make the adjustments to the language in hand. You need to change the Tenant Protection Act. You need to change the laws locally that make it easy and lawful for one to come in and break into someone's property. Make it a crime, you'll deter the crime, and you'll protect the most vulnerable people out there, which may surprise some of us, CMAC, are actually property owners.
Are people in California and Sacramento, the legislature, the lawmakers, are they paying attention to this?
They are paying attention to it, and that's the good news. The legislature is not only paying attention, but they're pretty much forced to by their constituents, right? And I think that's why you've seen the recent enactment of laws like SB 602, SB 448, a number of other laws out there. And you're sort of seeing this shift from a very sort of a tenant advocate based string of laws to now there's actually an open ear for people who own property. Another example is there's a law out there that did not pass. Sometimes I tell people, CMAC, you often learn more from the laws that don't pass than the laws that do. And there's a law out there that would have created essentially what's called an Office of Tenant Advocacy as a whole nother entire government arm. Would cost millions of dollars and whatnot. That failed. And by the way, one of their purposes would have been the protection of occupant rights, which could have been squatters, of course. The fact that that bill failed, and it did have more support than one would think, tells me there are some legislators out there that are waking up, hearing the cries and concerns of property owners, landlords who are saying enough is enough. And so now you have certain laws that allow you to post the 72-hour notice. And look, in being an optimist, I do think things are going to continue to shift in the other direction, not for the purpose of the landlord being right or the property owner being right. I always say it's not about who's right, it's about what's right, right? And I think at the end of the day, if we continue on in this direction where you have more laws that continue to give landowners and property owners a means by which to enforce their rights, to pay their bills, pay the mortgage, keep possession of their properties, I think you'll end up in a situation where you're able to penalize those who break in, and you're still able to protect those tenants who do need help. Because there are a lot of tenants that need protection. There are a lot of people at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, vulnerable people, individuals, classes of people that need protection. So it's important to continue to protect the most vulnerable, whether they be tenants, whether they be property owners. And I think over the next probably 3 to 5 years, you're going to see more laws that benefit property owners rather than disenfranchise them.
Now, if the laws change, is it possible to go after these people and prosecute them?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because the individual I referenced earlier wouldn't be able to say, "Oh, well, pursuant to California Evidence Code," the rebuttal from the judge will be, "Well, there's also a law that says you can't squat on somebody's property unlawfully. You can't be there," right? So again, I think the good news for property owners out there and landlords, yes, you're still in California. Yes, you're still dealing with squatters today, but the laws are changing day by day in your favor. And you ask anybody out there, even on the tenant side, landlord side, attorneys out there, they will tell you the wind is at the backs of landlords and property owners in terms of the movement, right, from the law, the legislators, and the advocates out there. Because I think people are waking up. They're waking up and saying, common sense says this is not right. So, but long answer to a short question, yes, it would make it far easier if the laws were changed to get someone out.
Jonathan Madison, real estate attorney. It was great to have you on California Insider.
Thank you. Always great to be here, CMAC.
Let us know what you think of the laws of squatting in California and nationally. You can always email us at siamak@californiainsider.com or comment. We read all of your emails and comments. I'm Siamak Khorrami, this is California Insider, and we'll see you next time.